Hello and welcome to Deep Talks, a new project by Deep Deutschland. Deep Deutschland is an independent NGO and a part of the Global Deep Network. Deep stands for Dialogue, Empathic Engagement, and Peace Building. On this program, we explore ideas, skills, and themes situated under the umbrella of peace and conflict studies, a broad multidisciplinary field that attempts to better understand conflicts and transform conflicts nonviolently with the aim to help make the world a better place for self, society, and the environment. I'm Kevin. I'll be your host today. There are numerous DEEP members attending, including project members Lena and Vipka. The chat is available. If you need anything, for example, technical issues, you can ask them in the chat. We do have a few questions for the audience that we'll ask through the Zoom poll feature throughout the show, and we'll have time for questions towards the end of the show. So today, we're exploring anger as viewed by the Stoic philosophy, and we are very excited and fortunate to have Donald J. Robertson with us today on Deep Talks. He is our first guest, and this is the very first show brought to you by Deep Events. Donald is a modern-day cognitive behavioral psychologist, Stoic practitioner, and author of 6 books on philosophy and psychology, including Stoicism in the Art of Happiness and How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. In short, he is an expert on applying and practicing Stoicism in a therapeutic setting. Donald, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very honored to be your first guest, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. Well, we'll just start it off. One of the aims of this program is to bring ideas and skills that we can apply in our daily life to people. A lot of times in our educational institutions, our upbringing, or in any other area of life where we could potentially learn tricks like this or strategies or skills, it doesn't always happen. And so we want to bring more practical advice that we can take with us on our life journey. And so just to start us off, Donald, how would you characterize anger from a Stoic's point of view or a cognitive behavioral psychologist?
Well, actually, the modern cognitive model of anger, the earliest model, was introduced by Aaron T. Beck in, I believe it was around about 1969 or the early 70s, in his book, The Cognitive Therapy of the Emotions. The early model used by him is very similar to the model used by the ancient Stoics, surprisingly, because there's a gap of 2,300 years between them, but there's a lot of similarity. So the Stoics had what we call an intellectual model of the emotions in the classics, but we would call it today a cognitive model of the emotions. And the cognitive model holds that our emotions are shaped to a large extent by underlying beliefs. And that's very important, because by becoming more aware of what those beliefs are, we first of all gain insight and more control over them. Also, we can begin to work on the underlying beliefs, challenge them, question them, and change them. So that opens up the whole toolbox of cognitive therapy techniques. And the Stoics thought actually that anger was one of the trickier emotions to define, but essentially they, like other schools of ancient Greek philosophy, believed that there's a particular type of anger that they're especially interested in, that they defined as a desire for revenge against other people. So first of all, they thought of, and this might sound a little bit unusual to us, but they thought of anger as a desire. And they thought of it as a desire to harm or to punish another person. because we believe that they violated a rule, or as the Stoics would put it, committed an injustice, and therefore they deserve to be punished in return. And so they thought basically anger is the desire for revenge. In Beck's cognitive model of anger, it's the belief that someone has violated a rule. They've done something that they shouldn't have done, and they deserve to be taught a lesson or be punished. And there might be other types of anger. For example, often there's a feeling that we can sometimes call a feeling of frustration that kind of overlaps with anger. Like if you're trying to fix a leaking tap and you're struggling to get it to work, then we wouldn't normally call that a desire for revenge against the tap. So there's a feeling of frustration that's part of what we sometimes mean by anger. And then there's this other interpersonal feeling that has more to do with punishing people and the perception that they've done something wrong. And the Stoics were particularly interested in that type of anger.
And I just wanted to kind of zoom in and make a connection to peace and conflict studies, in the sense that conflict is, in peace and conflict studies, most consider it a regular part of life that's not going away. It's often considered embedded in communication. But I would say that conflict and anger tend to hang out together. And there's some sort of anger would be the response to dealing with conflict. And how would you approach that from kind of the individual's me versus me approach? In a classic story, for example, you could have me versus nature, me versus the antagonist. But if we zoom into the individual, we have this me versus me tension. And this comes from, day one of being born.
Well, the Stoics don't really focus so much on this kind of intrapsychic way of looking at things as a sort of internal division. They do mention it sometimes. They're particularly interested in the idea of reason. Like that's really the central focus in Stoic philosophy. So they do talk about us being alienated from our own true nature, or in conflict with ourselves in that sense. So they think we need to train ourselves and work on ourselves in such a way that we learn to live more consistently and more in accord with reason and our underlying values. And they think that's what human fulfillment normally looks like. And they also feel that the Stoics have this kind of holistic vision. They were pantheists. So rather than believing that there was a kind of transcendent God or gods, they believed that the universe as a whole was something divine. And connected with that, they had the idea that we should view ourselves as being an integral part of something bigger. So they don't quite use this language, but the Stoics want us to view ourselves as being like cells within the body of a larger organism. They want us to see ourselves not as atomistic or individuals that are separate fundamentally from everything else, but they want us to see ourselves as being fundamentally part of something larger. And they think that when we get angry with other people, we're alienated from the rest of humanity and the rest of nature in a fundamental sense. And in order to be more fulfilled and to feel more complete, we need to work on that and learn to overcome it. So the Stoics want us to view the other people as our brothers and sisters. We call this Stoic cosmopolitanism, the idea that all human beings are fellow citizens of a single world community, or cosmic city, as the Stoics used to put it. And they want to restore this sense of unity and oneness, kind of brotherhood of man, if you like. And they think that tackling anger is really fundamental to that. Anger is one of the things that creates division in society, places us in conflict with other people.
It's kind of like systems thinking and the idea of oneness, right? And so harmony, often is used in, I think, more Eastern religions and philosophies. And so if you disrupt the equilibrium, for example, with anger, then you disrupt harmony within the systems. Does that sound about right? Okay.
Yeah. This idea of harmony actually is really integral to Stoicism. The original definition of the goal of life in Stoic philosophy, the founder of Stoicism, Zeno of Citium, said that the telos in Greek, the goal of life, is living in agreement. And the word that he uses for that in Greek also means living in harmony or living consistently. And actually, the Stoics thought that we live in harmony at 3 different levels. So we need to live in harmony with our own true nature. We need to learn to live in harmony with the universe as a whole. And that partly entails, they think, accepting and adapting to the events that befall us. And thirdly, they think we should strive to live in harmony with the rest of mankind. So these kind of sense of harmony at 3 different levels.
And based on harmony, you would need some sort of flexibility in your life processes. And so what does Stoicism have to say in terms of rigidity, which could also be dogmatism, or rigidity in maintaining strict behavioral patterns over and over versus learning, perhaps?
Well, let me think, because the Stoics, when we're dealing with an ancient philosophy like Stoicism that's articulated in a different language, they use different idioms to express their ideas. So they don't talk so much about flexibility. That's not a word that you probably find in, for example, in the translation of Stoic texts. But there are probably ideas that we can draw parallels with. So the Stoics are particularly concerned with the idea of being rigidly attached to external events. They think that's really the root of many of our problems. And they think that the secret to having what they describe as a smoothly flowing life, which I guess would be a kind of flexible, adaptive life, is not being so forcefully over-attached to external things, learning to accept fate and adapt to it. And they think the key to doing that is using our mind, using reason, basically, to respond to events and not to impose demands on external events, but to enter into any undertaking with the acceptance that things might not necessarily turn out as we desire. The Stoics call that the reserve clause. So Seneca gives the example, I will travel to Athens, fate permitting, or I will travel to Athens if nothing prevents me. So the Stoics set goals for themselves, but they always qualify those goals by saying the opposite might happen, or I might be thwarted, and I'm willing to accept and adapt to that as well. So anticipating adversity is, I guess, integral to Stoic flexibility.
It sounds like it's a focus on the journey and a focus on the process more than the outcome.
Yeah, definitely. And this is a common theme in a lot of Greek philosophy. This idea that the process is more important in a sense than the outcome. And that's integral to what we mean by, the way we would phrase it would be that Stoicism is a virtue ethic. So for Stoics, our character, the quality of our character is more important than the external outcomes that we achieve. So the way that we go about doing things with courage, self-discipline, wisdom, integrity, and so on is more important than whether we succeed or not. It's our intentions that matter. So in order to act with justice, we have to desire certain external outcomes, but we can't always be guaranteed to succeed in achieving them. So moral value resides for Stoics fundamentally in the way that we go about living our lives, the way that we approach things.
And so bringing it back to just anger in general, how one interprets the stimuli, or how one perhaps gets angry, what types of practices would one go about implementing into their life to live a more stable and rational life and not react, for example?
Well, the funny thing is that the Stoics wrote books on anger, and we're very lucky that we have an entire book on Stoic therapy for anger written by Seneca called On Anger, which still survives today. And also one of the other famous Stoic texts, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, is very much focused on anger. And the Stoics give us loads of practical techniques. So at one point in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, he lists 10 distinct psychological strategies for coping with anger. So not just one or two, but 10 different techniques. And then in Seneca and in our other Stoic texts, we get other additional techniques even beyond those. So one of the fundamental Stoic techniques is to draw a clearer distinction between things that are under our direct control and things that are not. We have a handbook on Stoicism called the Enchiridion by Epictetus, the most famous Stoic teacher, and that's the opening sentence of it, the foundation. It says, some things are up to us and other things are not. Now that seems like a truism, like that's just like saying some things are big and some things are small. But Epictetus's point is that people often blur this distinction and they struggle against things that aren't actually under their direct control, kind of banging their head against a wall. And they also neglect to take responsibility for things that are potentially under their direct control in life. So although this seems like a truism, some things are up to us, other things are not, it seems like we're stating the obvious, it's actually something that we find people are incredibly confused about, and that they can benefit from clarifying in their thinking. And a corollary of that is probably the most famous principle of Stoicism, and it's the most famous principle because it's used in cognitive therapy. It's widely quoted in cognitive therapy, and it says it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. So it's not things that make us angry, but rather our value judgments, our thinking, and our beliefs in response to them. The way we interpret events is what really shapes our anger, at least to a large extent. That's the basis of cognitive therapy. So the Stoics think that by reminding ourselves of this principle, we'll take more responsibility for our thinking, which is under our direct control, and we'll be better able to adapt to the external events that befall us, which aren't directly under our control. And in doing that, we'll experience less frustration, we'll take more ownership for our emotions, and we'll experience a healthier emotional response to external events. So those are just two of the techniques that they employ. But like I say, there's probably at least a dozen other ones that we could pick out of the Stoic writings, specifically for anger.
And so you did mention responsibility. And I see a connection to, in one of your previous presentations, the Delphic Oracle, Wisdom and Seven Maxims. I attended it, and it mentioned one of the maxims on the Pythian Oracle in Athens, I believe, was know thyself. Mm-hmm. And so I see this connection between know thyself and responsibility, and not everyone comes to a point where they say, I'm something, I have responsibility for myself, regardless if I learned something in school or I was thrown into this world in an unfair situation. And so what would be kind of your view on know thyself, and what does that entail?
Well, it's fine. It means lots of things, because people traditionally thought the Pythia kind of spoke cryptically or in riddles. And Plutarch, who was both a priest at Delphi and also a famous philosopher, so he's in a very unique, very good position to comment on the philosophical significance of these maxims. He says, look, these sayings are interpreted in lots of different ways by philosophers, because they're kind of just like little seeds that the Pythia planted. They're really cool ideas, but then she left it up to people to figure out how best to interpret them. So we have a few different interpretations, and one of them is that Plutarch, and if I remember rightly, Seneca as well, say, perhaps surprisingly, that they believe that gonothai se auton, like know thyself, means that we should become aware of the fact that we are mortal. So it's a contemplation of our own mortality. And that has something to do with the fact that it's written outside the temple to Apollo. And so when you're entering the temple, you should remember that you're entering this divine space, the space of an immortal, but you're merely a mortal in his presence. So one interpretation is that it's about remembering our own finitude and mortality, our own weakness and vulnerability, in a sense. But Epictetus also talks about this, and he says, very much in Stoic terms, that know thyself is about understanding what's up to us and what isn't. So to understand who we are, in a sense, would be to understand what we control. And if we can understand what's directly under our voluntary control in life, we'll have a better grasp of our essential nature as human beings. And so Epictetus thinks that know thyself also indicates what we today would call kind of mindfulness practice. So by paying close attention to our seat of control, by our volition, we understand the essence of our nature, and that that's something that we should learn to pay attention to continuously throughout life. So we'd be observing our own mental activity, and in particular, Epictetus thinks we should observe the way that our thinking and our value judgments shape our behavior and our emotions. So for Stoics, this know thyself concept actually evolves into a continual practice of mindfulness.
Okay, because one of the thoughts that comes to mind is triggers. It's connected with anger because when we are dealing with different stimuli or conflicts in our life, typically everybody has certain triggers and they're different for everyone. And it could be, for one, it's something that doesn't make sense to another. And so by knowing thyself, how would you explain to better get to know your triggers and to prepare for them?
I don't think there's an interpretation in the ancient literature that explicitly refers to triggers, although Socrates in Xenophon's Memorabilia says something that's kind of a little bit along those lines. He says we should understand what our strengths and our weaknesses are in life, our vulnerabilities. And that would be a little bit like understanding which triggers we're particularly vulnerable to and which ones we might risk being overwhelmed by and which ones might be challenging but more within our ability to deal with. So there's a hint of that actually in the Socratic literature, but certainly I think that's important, and it's implied in Stoicism that we should be aware of what our individual vulnerabilities are and what our potential is for overcoming or mastering some of those triggers. So I think this is actually an idea that is very important for modern people trying to train in Stoicism and understand Stoicism. I think it's something that people often get wrong. The Stoics think that we need to approach dealing with provocative situations as if we're choosing a sparring partner. This is the analogy that they like to use. If we were wrestling or boxing or doing the Pancratian, pick a partner to spar with. And you wouldn't pick somebody who's really easy and wouldn't really stretch you and test your abilities. But you also wouldn't pick somebody who's twice your size and much stronger and more skilled than you, who would just kind of wipe the floor with you. So you pick somebody, who's going to be a challenge for you, and you might improve your strength and your skill in fighting. So the Stoics say life is like that. There may be situations that are outside of our comfort zone and difficult for us to deal with. And we should be willing to face challenges in life in order to exercise virtue and strengthen our character. But we also have to realize when we're biting off more than we can chew, and we might be potentially overwhelmed by certain triggering situations. And it's the same in modern cognitive therapy. We would say to people that they would often construct a graduated hierarchy for exposure. and they would start off with less challenging situations and then progressively work their way up towards more challenging ones as they become more confident and they develop more coping skills.
And so when we deal with conflict, for example, one way to see conflict as in life is a learning opportunity. It's always going to be in our lives. And so how we decide to approach it and how we reflect on it is going to be, it's going to make the difference if it's a learning opportunity or not. And so in Stoicism, how do you see these challenges? For example, I remember reading in your book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, Rustica, I believe his name is. He was sort of a model for Marcus Aurelius. And so he was able to kind of push him to the edge sometimes, but then pull back. And I think it was almost like he was teaching him lessons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's something paradoxical about that. Right at the beginning of the Meditations, Junius Rusticus was his mentor. He was a very senior Roman statesman. He was a Stoic teacher to Marcus Aurelius. Now, Marcus intriguingly says that it was Rusticus that provoked his anger more than anyone else. But he also says that Rusticus was the guy that taught him how to resolve conflict. And as he puts it, to be reconciled with people that he'd had an argument with. So Rusticus both provoked Marcus's anger and also taught him how to overcome his anger. Yeah, and it does seem like he was perhaps challenging him. In the ancient world, in Cynic philosophy and Stoic philosophy, Cynic philosophy is like a sort of precursor of Stoic philosophy. It kind of preceded it. There's a lot of overlap, a similarity between them. They have this principle that they call Paresia, which means frankness or plain speaking or freedom of speech. And someone who was training in a philosophy like Stoicism would sometimes pick a mentor and they would explicitly give them permission to be completely honest with them. It's a little bit like the Catholic idea of confession, actually. You'd have a mentor to whom you would discuss your weaknesses, your errors, your flaws, and you would allow them to say very incisive things about your character, to critique you very thoroughly. And you try not to get annoyed with them about doing that. And it sounds as if that's what was going on with Marcus Aurelius and Rusticus, that Rusticus was maybe challenging Marcus and questioning his behavior and his character in a very penetrating way, and that sometimes Marcus felt kind of overwhelmed by that. But overall, he felt that it was an enlightening and a beneficial process.
And in life, a lot of people don't necessarily have role models. It could be a shaman, a coach, a teacher, pretty much anyone to live by example. And so what tricks would you have for someone seeking this information or opportunity?
See, the Stoics taught through lectures and by writing books, but they also said that the best way to learn philosophy was by living in the presence of somebody who's more advanced along the path. And so Seneca says this very explicitly. But the Stoics also knew that their mentors and teachers sometimes died or that they'd be separated from them. Of course, they had to recognize that. So Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, is kind of the ultimate mentor to the early Stoics in a way, but he died eventually. And so the Stoics realized that they had to find other ways of doing what we would call modeling, cognitive or behavioral modeling, so modeling attitudes or modeling behaviors. And in part, they did that by studying historical figures. So today in cognitive therapy, we might say to somebody, do you have somebody in your life that you could admire and learn from? And often people can't really think of somebody. So they might nevertheless think even of a fictional character or a historical character who copes well with stress, who deals well with provocative people and whose behavior they can emulate. Or even a hypothetical character So the Stoics would often discuss the idea of the ideal wise man. And so they talk about the hypothetical ideal sage and the qualities that that person would possess. And they would be very clear that no such person had ever actually existed. But nevertheless, they thought that we could learn by trying to imagine what somebody perfectly wise and self-disciplined might look like and what they might do in certain challenging situations. One of the things that we know actually in modern psychology from a number of experiments, we make a distinction between mastery modeling and coping modeling. So mastery modeling is when we look at somebody who's perfect, who's already mastered the skill, like the world's greatest public speaker. And coping modeling would be looking at somebody who's imperfect and who's struggling with a problem, but in the process of improving and getting better at it. And there are pros and cons to both of these forms of modeling, but generally it seems that people benefit the most actually from coping modeling. In particular, people with certain types of psychological problems like social anxiety or clinical depression, sometimes if they try to emulate people who they think are perfect at doing something, it's difficult for them to figure out how they would get closer towards that goal. And it might actually just make them feel bad by making a negative comparison. Whereas if I'm struggling with anxiety, for example, and I talk to other people who have similar problems with anxiety, but have maybe made more progress in coping with it, then it's easier for me to see what lessons I could take from the things that they've achieved and adapt that to my own life. So often we find that coping modeling is actually more useful for people than mastery modeling. But the Stoics do both. They like to talk about this idea of the ideal sage, but they also like to learn from other Stoics. And actually we can see Seneca doing that in his letters to Lucilius. He specifically says that he's not an expert like a physician, but rather he's like another patient in the hospital bed beside Lucilius. He said, we're both in hospital together, metaphorically, but it's just that I've been undergoing treatment for longer. And so I can discuss the progress of my own treatment. And that's like a peer support model. It's a bit like Alcoholics Anonymous or something, the way that Stoics understand their relationship with each other, rather than a sort of guru-student relationship.
A technique that more recently I've been thinking about in terms of visualizing how you might act when someone else is there. I was thinking about how from such a young age, we watch and observe our parents and those around us, and we kind of inherit some of these communication patterns, traumas, behavioral patterns, including how we get angry and how we deal with anger. And I was thinking how if I was a father, what would I do differently if my son or daughter was actually learning from my actions? And it's a similar visualization strategy, I think, to do what would Jesus do, for example. It's kind of something to ask yourself in this moment, and then rather than continue without that awareness, you can go through it a bit more in a response rather than a reaction.
Mm-hmm. The Stoics actually have literally the same technique. Epictetus says to his students, ask yourself what Zeno or what Socrates would do when you're facing a challenging situation. So he literally says to his students, we have a record, like a sort of transcribed version of the seminars that the Stoic teacher Epictetus gave. And so we can see him literally saying, ask yourself what Socrates or what Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, would do in a particular situation. And then they have other variations of that. And a little bit like you were saying, if you were a parent, in cognitive therapy today, it's also quite common to say to people, if they hold a particular belief that might be problematic, to help them evaluate it from a different perspective, there are many questions we can ask. And one of them is, would you teach that same belief or that same philosophy of life or those same values to your son or your daughter? And, many people will kind of cling on to or defend unhelpful or unhealthy beliefs. But when asked to evaluate them from that perspective, they might say, oh, actually, no, like it would seem crazy to teach that to a kid. It's obviously not a helpful way to approach life. So many of these cognitive techniques are actually about getting people just to look at things from a different angle, a different perspective. And when they do that, they're often quite capable, surprisingly capable of spotting the flaws, or the problems in their own thinking.
And this brings me to a thought on creativity. Because when we talk about perspective taking, one way to look at creativity is to be able to see things from different perspectives, reframe scenarios, and even put yourself in someone else's shoes. And when it comes to anger, the body goes through a lot of physiological and cognitive and emotional changes. And so how do you see anger compared with creativity? How do these work together or against each other?
Well, I would say in many regards, most obviously, anger is antagonistic to creativity. There may be creative ways of being angry, but generally speaking, anger can be quite antagonistic to creativity. So the reason for that is that when people are feeling relaxed, and I guess you could say in their natural, their healthy state of mind, they're usually they exhibit cognitive flexibility. So people naturally are able to entertain multiple perspectives at once, to shift freely between different angles or perspectives, or at least most people can do this fairly well. And we're usually able to pay attention to many things at once. So you can be driving the car and listening to the radio and talking to your kids in the back seat and also thinking about what you're going to have for dinner. We can walk and chew gum. But when people become very angry, their thinking tends to become more rigid. They think more in terms of sweeping generalizations. Their attention usually becomes narrowed as well, so they're less able to multitask and think about multiple things at once. They kind of put the thing that's annoying them under a magnifying glass, as it were. And all of these kind of restrictions on our thinking tend to inhibit our creativity. And another indication of that is that psychologists are very interested in a bunch of cognitive skills, a cluster of cognitive skills that we call problem solving. It's a technical term that we use for a bunch of abilities. And creativity is an important part usually of rational problem solving. But when people are angry, they're usually pretty bad at rational problem solving. They're not able to generate as many alternative possible solutions to the problems that they're facing, and they're not as good at evaluating the consequences of different options or planning how to put them into practice effectively. So we become poorer problem solvers when we allow ourselves to get enraged, generally speaking. Our thinking tends to become more generalized and more impulsive, and we experience a whole bunch of other cognitive biases, actually. One, for example, is that when people are angry, they are more likely to underestimate risk compared to non-angry people. And so that means that they're more likely to put themselves or other people in danger. Like, for example, a boxer who gets enraged might be more likely to throw wild punches and drop his guard. Like, he'll make himself more vulnerable. So this is something that people often underestimate. Marcus Aurelius talks about this idea, actually, that in his society, and I think in some ways in our society, people think of anger as being kind of tough or macho, but actually there's something inherent about anger that makes us weaker and more vulnerable, because we tend to expose ourselves more to danger unwittingly when we're in the throes of anger.
Lena did a poll, actually, and asked the participants here today, have you ever regretted something you did when you were angry? And the results were 100% said yes.
Yes, 100%.
So regret is a big concept in terms of anger and action.
Yeah, I'll tell you a little story about that. Maybe you've heard this one, Kevin, and maybe it's I think it's in How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. But it's a famous story. So Galen of Pergamon, who's one of the most famous physicians and medical researchers in antiquity, was writing a book on psychopathology. It's called The Passions and Errors of the Soul. And he gives the following case vignette. And Galen, incidentally, is famous in his own right, but he's also famous because he happened to be court physician to Marcus Aurelius. So Galen says, I'll give you a good example of somebody getting angry in a pathological way and regretting what they did. The Emperor Hadrian had a notoriously bad temper, and he lost his temper once with a slave. We don't know why, but over some trivial thing, presumably. And unfortunately for this unlucky slave, Hadrian was writing at the time, and he had a stylus in his hand, which is kind of the Roman equivalent of a fountain pen. And he stabbed the slave in the eye with this pen and blinded the guy. And then Hadrian eventually calmed down. I think that it was the following day he summoned the slave and said, look, I feel really bad about what happened. I guess he was embarrassed about it. And also other people had seen what had happened. And so Hadrian, experienced remorse, maybe not so much because he cared about the slave, but perhaps because he was concerned about what the onlookers thought of him. He was acting like a monster. So he said to this guy, is there anything I can do to make it up to you? Now, this is the emperor talking, the most powerful man in the world. And the slave took quite a while to answer. Galen says he wasn't really sure what to say. And then he summoned up the courage to say, well, look, all that I really want is my eye back. And that, of course, was the one thing that even Hadrian, the most powerful man in the world, couldn't give him back. So the moral of that story for Galen is that sometimes when we're angry, we do damage that's actually completely irreparable. And we often underestimate how harmful the damage can be when we give way to anger. We often do things that we regret when we're angry. But sometimes the damage can actually be completely irreparable. And also, if you look back over the course of your life and think of the consequences of anger, you can probably think of many examples of situations where anger caused problems for you or for other people in life.
You brought up Marcus Aurelius earlier, and I mean, as a Roman emperor, he has to use a lot of good communication skills. And just like a peace worker or peace practitioner, you want to focus on dialogue and diplomacy as your tools. And of course, anger is the antagonist, and it doesn't help your objectives. In this case, how do the Stoics see or approach communication skills? And do you have any tips in terms of effective diplomacy?
Well, we don't have much in the way of Stoic writing on things like diplomacy, although we know that the founders of Stoicism actually wrote books on rhetoric, on communication skills. But Stoic rhetoric was kind of notorious in the ancient world because the Stoics believed in speaking objectively and suspending strong value judgments or emotive language. So in a way, Stoic rhetoric is almost anti-rhetoric. It's almost the opposite of what we normally think of as rhetoric. So ancient rhetoricians, orators, and sophists used to try and use very emotive language and strong value judgments to really whip up the emotions of the audience and manipulate them. And the Stoics were trying to do the polar opposite of this. They thought we should learn to stick to the facts and describe things in objective language. They call this fantasia cataleptica, which is hard to translate into English. It means a representation of things that grasps reality, or scholars sometimes translate it as an objective representation of the situation. And we do this in cognitive therapy as well. In fact, it's done in training in problem-solving skills. So we teach people, for example, a client might come into therapy and say that they were very anxious. because they spoke at a meeting, and they might say, somebody shot me down in flames and they tore a strip off me, and I just wish the ground would open and swallow me up. That's what happened, and that's how I felt. And the therapist might say, could you describe that again without any of the colourful language, the metaphors, the emotive language, just describing the bare facts of what actually happened? And they might say, I gave a presentation and somebody said that they disagreed with part of the content. And that sounds much less upsetting, but maybe that's a neutral, an objective description of what actually happened. So we evolved rhetoric to manipulate the emotions of other people through oratory and poetry. But unwittingly, we use the same figures of speech, we use the same type of language on ourselves, which seems kind of crazy. So we're always whipping our own emotions up by using colourful language and strong value judgments and metaphors and so on that are designed to stimulate emotion. And that can be very unhelpful. People very often do that when they're getting angry and ruminating about something. They use language that's kind of designed to fuel anger. The Stoics want us to back out of that and try and use language that's more fact-based and objective. And that potentially could contribute, I think, in some ways to diplomacy. The Stoics thought we should try to speak plainly and honestly with other people, but unlike some other schools of philosophy, they also thought that we need to speak tactfully to others, and we need to learn to speak in such a way that people are going to be receptive to our words, so that we're not overwhelming them by saying things that are too confrontational or too challenging for them.
One of the authors that I've read numerous times while studying peace and conflict studies is Marshall Rosenberg. Have you heard of his work?
Yeah.
Okay, and he uses a lot of, he gives a lot of, basically a framework in terms of how we communicate with others. And it has a lot of similarities in this in terms of more objective, what do I see, what do I need, what do I want, instead of you statements and blame. And I think this is it has a very similar approach because it gets more to the subtext or the needs and wants rather than perhaps what the sophists would do, which is to incite and stir up the emotions.
There are some interesting parallels with Stoicism. Actually, Marcus Aurelius in particular thinks that, how can I explain this idea? There's an idea that goes back to Socrates. Socrates had this notorious idea. It's very controversial, but it's very interesting. So Socrates famously said that no man does evil knowingly or willingly. And that's because he believed that everybody fundamentally shares the same goal in life. We all want fulfillment and eudaimonia. Like, we all want what's best. Socrates believed they were inherently committed to this. But the problem is that we get confused about the best way to go about it. So people might even do terrible, violent, destructive things, that even tyrants and dictators. But nevertheless, fundamentally, they believe that what they're doing is justified or right. And so this way of looking at things potentially in Stoicism and in Socratic philosophy in general contributes to a kind of empathy. It's a strategy for building empathy. If we try to understand what somebody's underlying motive is and find the common ground that we might share with them. So accepting that we object to what someone's doing, we might think they're going about it in the wrong way, maybe even a very unjust or a very destructive way, but at some level, that there's a desire or a value that perhaps we could share. And that allows us maybe to talk to the other person about alternative ways of satisfying their underlying values or goals. And that's potentially a more productive basis for diplomacy than just judging the other person to be completely in the wrong. And that's the approach that Marcus Aurelius adopts. And Marcus Aurelius also, interestingly, says that the first thing that he does when he gets angry with another person is to try and imagine that he has the capability within him of making the same errors that they're making. So he also begins by adopting this perspective of humility and thinking, okay, this person's done something very greedy and very selfish, but I can be greedy and selfish as well sometimes. So rather than putting himself on a pedestal or a high horse, he starts off by acknowledging that he has the same character flaws or defects that he identifies in the other person. And that helps him to moderate his feelings of anger and makes him less judgmental, I guess we could say, towards the other person.
Which is, yeah, put yourself in the other person's shoes. And okay. And earlier you did mention the 10 maxims. And I think we've made through a good number of them, but there's a couple left that we haven't touched on. Could you bring up a few more of those?
Mm-hmm. The first one actually is an odd one. It's Marcus Aurelius' favorite one. I think it's the one that initially people are least likely to accept. And Marcus believed that human nature is intrinsically social. This is a long-standing tradition actually in Greek philosophy. It goes all the way back past Socrates to the Sophists. So the Stoics believed that human beings are inherently thinking, reasoning creatures. And given that, like, we should think of ourselves as having an obligation to use reason well, to use it to the best of our ability. But they also think we're intrinsically social creatures. They don't think we would survive if it wasn't for the fact that we form families and communities. And so they think it's baked into our fundamental nature that we're designed to cooperate with each other. And therefore, they argue that we should view ourselves as having a fundamental obligation to live in harmony, to play nicely, to cooperate well with other people. And so this is kind of Marcus's foundation. It's his starting point in a sense. He wants to remind himself that he has this duty to do the best that he can to live in harmony with other people and overcome his feelings of anger. Other Stoic techniques, the Stoics believe that anger often is based on a perceived threat or injury. But they also believe that injuries are often due to our value judgments. So it's not things that upset me, but my opinions about them. And so the Stoics think if we dig underneath anger, like, we can overcome the sense of being offended or injured by other people, and then we're less likely to develop feelings of anger in response to them. So if somebody calls me an idiot or something, if I think, well, that's what offer a duck's back, it doesn't really, I'm not injured by that. You know, if I can overcome my sense of offense or injury, I'm less likely then to experience anger in response to the other person. The Stoics also think that we should practice asking ourselves what the opposite of a feeling of anger would be like. Is there a contrary virtue that it'd be worth developing? And they think that the opposite or antidote to anger is benevolence or kindness. And so they think that we should spend time contemplating what kindness and benevolence and other similar virtues look like, and then practice actively cultivating those. So in addition to having remedies for anger, they think we should also actively try and cultivate the opposing virtues to anger. And this is also a concept that we find in modern psychotherapy as well. One way of getting rid of a bad habit is to actively cultivate a contrary or opposing habit. We call that reciprocal inhibition in behavior therapy, or counter conditioning is another technical term that we use for doing this. And we also do a thing in therapy today called functional analysis, where we get people to carefully consider the consequences of their action. And the Stoics do that as well. They have a slogan that says that anger does us more harm than the things that we're angry about. And they think of this in kind of two senses. There's a superficial sense in which often getting really angry with people causes us more practical problems, perhaps, than the thing that the other person did. So if somebody says something and I perceive it as an insult, that in itself might be trivial. But if I get really angry and then I fall out with that person and it causes me problems at work, it can cause me practical or interpersonal problems that are far more serious than the initial perceived insult, let's say. But the Stoics also mean this in a much deeper and more philosophical sense. They think that anger does us more harm than the things that we're angry about, because the things that other people do that trigger our anger, we always have the opportunity to cope with wisely or patiently. It's up to us how we respond to those things. They don't necessarily have to harm us. In fact, we could potentially learn from them. We could adapt to them. But anger itself penetrates to the very core of our character. It damages us right at the very heart of our being. And so the Stoics think that anger does us more harm than the things that we're angry about, because the things we're angry about are merely external events, whereas anger itself transforms our mind and character and can make us into lesser versions of ourselves. And that's the Stoics think the real thing that we should be concerned about in life.
Do you see any room, or let's say this, there's a lot of conflicts and injustices in the world. World over, we have a lot of issues that need to be worked on, from violence to bad faith actors. And though we can work on our own self, which is a very important process, how do you see anger in terms of these injustices, and some who get energy and feel their anger is justified?
Well, it's actually of the very nature of anger that when people are at their most angry, they often feel at their most justified. So in ancient philosophy, there was this idea that sometimes anger could be righteous or healthy. But I think this is quite a dangerous concept, because angry people, typically the worst tyrants in history, believed that they were completely justified and righteous in doing the terrible things that they did. So I think we should be wary about righteous anger and that sense of justification, and question it in ourselves. How do we address it in other people? The Stoics very much believe that we need to it starts at home, it starts with ourselves, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's of the very nature of anger that it tends to easily turn into a spiral. So somebody insults me on the internet or whatever, I get annoyed and I want to insult them back. Now I've made them even worse than they were before. And so they'll reciprocate and make me even worse than I was before. And we kind of get in this death spiral where we're both making each other angrier and angrier. And that's of the nature of arguments. And so the Stoics think, well, the best thing that we can do is to stop the cycle. Marcus Aurelius says the best form of revenge is to be unlike the other person, i.e. not angry like them, to break this kind of vicious cycle that happens. And also by modeling a healthier response to anger. They thought the best way to teach other people is just by demonstrating virtue and wisdom in our own behavior. Showing other people a better, a more patient, a more empathic way of responding to provocation. You know, apart from the fact it breaks the cycle, it also perhaps leads the way and shows the other person an example of what might be more pro-social and a healthier way of responding to an argument.
And from a defense mechanism point of view, you know, I've seen in certain situations where once someone goes on the defensive side, they tend to close up, not only in terms of communication, but also they go into a preservation state. You know, they become less open, and then it becomes a battle of protecting the ego in this sense. And as we talked about earlier, when creativity shuts down and anger takes over, we close off the potential options that we could potentially act on for creative problem solving. And then, so in terms of, if we put it into an kind of an activist's role, trying to change a lot of the problems that we have, would you say start always from the inside, lead by example,
yes,
and maintain dialogue?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think this is fundamentally what's lacking in modern society in a way. You know, there's everybody wants to change everyone else. Like the internet's full of people like that think everyone else is wrong and you've got a problem. Anger is an externalizing emotion. So we often say in modern psychotherapy, when we're kind of simplifying emotions, psychotherapy to a large extent is about simplifying concepts for clients. We take research, which is complicated, like therapists have to be trained to understand and interpret it, but then we have to put it into layman's terms for clients so that they can understand it in a more simple, down-to-earth way. So, for example, when we're talking about emotions, we usually say, like, there's three broad categories of negative emotion: anger, fear, and sadness. And then there's kind of variations of those or overlap between them. But broadly speaking, we have these three main types of emotion. Now, people who have problems with fear, anxiety, or sadness, depression, often refer themselves for psychotherapy. But people who predominantly have anger issues tend not to self-refer for psychotherapy, with some exceptions. Like, because angry people think that everyone else has a problem. If I was really angry with you, I'd think that you need to go and have therapy because there's something wrong with you rather than with me. So this is one of the reasons that anger is kind of a unique issue psychologically, and a problem that hasn't been addressed in the same kind of way as other psychological problems. And this is why we have to think more creatively about how to address the problem of anger. So I think even in self-improvement literature, I'm often surprised how little reference there is to people learning to overcome their own feelings of anger. I call it, in fact, the royal road to self-improvement. The internet is awash with self-help and self-improvement advice, and hardly any of it refers to overcoming our own feelings of anger, because it's the area where people often tend not to look. They're more likely to justify their feelings of anger. So I think there's a great opportunity there for people to work on themselves and improve themselves, and in a way that has a special benefit for our relationship with other people and with society as a whole.
One of the polls that Lena sent out, another poll, she asked, have you ever studied anger, the concept of anger? And 77% said on their own, 18% said in their upbringing, so somewhat in the household or parents, 14% said they studied anger in school, and in the last 14% said never. And when I think about my schooling, we didn't really go over concepts such as self-responsibility, anger, how do you look at the subtext? So going back to what you just finished saying, sometimes anger can be disguised, but it's actually another emotion or feeling. I think this is kind of what I pulled out of it partly. For example, if someone is afraid or insecure inside, it could actually come externally, or it could be showed as anger. And so even if we are working on ourselves, we have to deal with a lot of other people who might also be working on their own anger issues, and taking into account that we might not always see the full picture and what they're doing and feeling. And there is one other poll. Lena asked, we have all experienced anger, but have you ever studied it? Oh no, that's the same one. Sorry, one moment. She asked, how many have practiced some form of Stoicism? And 57% said sometimes, 39% said a lot, and 4% said never. But I think Stoicism would be a wonderful class in school, as would be a philosophy class, to learn things that help us navigate the rough terrain of life. Okay, this question is from Martin Pritchard. Are angry particularly violent responses ever justified? And he gives the example, what about an Antifa member violently or angrily interacting with a neo-Nazi? Would that be wrong? And then parentheses, with calm violence, whether necessary or not unlikely to be achievable. Does that, it's in the chat here if you would like to read it.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm going to basically adopt the classical Socratic Stoic line and say that I think anger is never justified. So in the ancient world, there were people that disagreed about that. Aristotle thought there was healthy, righteous anger. There could be moderate anger, but I disagree. I think anything that anger can do, reason and love can do better. Personal, that's my personal view. And gosh, I'll try and be concise about this, but I think there are many reasons for adopting what seems like quite a radical view. One of them is very simply, as I mentioned earlier, the emotion of anger tends to be associated with a whole bunch of cognitive biases, right? So sometimes people say, well, anger is useful because it can motivate you to address social injustice. Yeah, but it biases your thinking, so you're less likely to do it effectively. Like, you're going to be impaired in terms of your rational decision making and problem solving. So anger clouds our thinking. Why would we want to motivate ourselves in a way that simultaneously clouds our thinking? That's quite problematic, I think. And some of the worst things that happen in society, I think, are done by people who believe that they're addressing the injustice perpetrated by others. So I think, for the example of an Antifa member using violence against someone that they consider to be a neo-Nazi or whatever, this way of thinking is, I think, really a big problem in modern society. And I would say categorically they're wrong. And using anger to promote violence in a situation like that's not appropriate. It's a risk factor for the spread of domestic terrorism, in fact, in modern American society. It's a highly topical, sensitive subject at the moment. I'm much more in favour of legal and peaceful means of protest or action against other violent groups. So I don't think we should fight violence with violence, except in highly exceptional circumstances. And even then, if we have to, psychologists have long sought to, another very simple confusion is that people tend to equate assertive or violent or aggressive behavior with feelings of anger. And actually, they're two completely different things. So someone could act in a forceful, assertive, or even a violent way without feeling the emotion of anger and without having their thinking biased in the way that anger does. And so sometimes we might have to mete out punishment calmly. If somebody's attacking an innocent person, you might use force against them, for example, and you'd be justified in doing that. But it wouldn't necessarily be right to do it on the basis of feelings of anger. And that might actually be the least effective way to do it. That leads into another whole conversation I've had many times in the past, which is about the fact that when people are angry, they're often not particularly effective at self-defense, for example. And in violent conflict situations, anger is often actually a disadvantage. I won't dig into that too deeply right now, but just to give you a really famous example of that, in the boxing match known as the Rumble in the Jungle, Muhammad Ali famously provoked George Foreman's anger because he realized that anger was George Foreman's greatest weakness, and Foreman exhausted himself, dropped his guard, and threw wild punches because Ali succeeded in provoking his anger. So it made Foreman a less effective boxer. And actually, Ali, of course, won the fight by a knockout. So this is the same in many situations in life. People think that anger might give them an advantage in certain physical confrontations, but in fact, often it's a practical disadvantage. And often, I mean, the most difficult problems that we face in life are interpersonal problems, social problems. And we have to have our wits about us in order to deal with them. They're nuanced and complex. To really deal with social problems, we have to empathize with other people. We have to understand complex motivations. And when we get angry, we become blind to a lot of that stuff, and our solutions tend to become very simplistic. This is my view, that modern society really is suffering at the moment, particularly in the United States, from this idea that certain groups, extremist groups, should be met with violence. I think this is really a highly toxic way of thinking.
So Lucas would like to ask a question. He's going to turn his microphone on.
Yes, hello, good evening, everyone.
Hi, Lucas.
So thank you very much, Professor Robertson. To be honest, I'm fairly new to this topic, but I think it's very fascinating. To me, as someone who doesn't know much about it, it appears as if the main approach of the Stoics was a very rigorous way of self-discipline and self-learning to actually change the world by example. So my question is, how did the Stoics react? How did they deal with a, say, angry, uneducated tyrant? And not only that, but some of them actually being in the position of power, even being the emperor of Rome, which is often described as having been like a giant killing machine. How did they deal with this dilemma of actually trying to lead by example, but also having this kind of responsibility?
Okay, I'll try to answer that question, but it's a difficult question to answer because it's very broad. So I'll answer it by picking a specific example of a historical event, if that's okay. So Marcus Aurelius actually had to deal with a civil war during his reign. So he was commander-in-chief of the Roman legions. He was in this position of tremendous political and military power. But one of his generals, a guy called Avidius Cassius, had himself declared emperor in the East and sought to break away from the empire. So he instigated a civil war against Marcus Aurelius. And we have a record of a speech that Marcus gave to his legions in response to this. And this is not the only way that a Stoic might respond. The Stoics disagreed among themselves about political questions. I should be clear about that. Stoicism is a virtue ethic, so it's based on principles, but Stoics might disagree about how to apply those principles to specific situations, right? Nevertheless, this is what Marcus Aurelius actually did, and what he did was really shocking. It, I think, astounded the legionaries who were standing, must have astounded the legionaries who heard this remarkable speech. So Marcus began his speech by saying that if he'd actually had the opportunity to do so, he would have stood down from the office of emperor and voluntarily appeared in front of a Senate hearing in order to defend his position and hear the grievances of the general that had instigated the civil war, because Marcus wanted to say, I would much rather have resolved this in the form of a rational debate than by having to have a war over it. But that opportunity had now passed. And so he mobilized an army to march against Avidius Cassius because he believed that it was necessary to do so in order to defend the empire, to defend Rome in particular, the city of Rome, which was, they believed was about to be sacked. And then Marcus did something really quite astounding, which is that he publicly pardoned Avidius Cassius and everybody else involved in the uprising against him. And he did that because he believed that if he didn't do it, it would be impossible for them to back down and surrender. And although this was a really shocking thing, a very surprising thing for him to have done, and actually it's the opposite of what the Senate had done. The Senate got the news about a week before Marcus, because the distances involved. Marcus was far from Rome at the time. He was in Serbia. And the Senate had responded with aggression. They'd seized Avidius Cassius's assets and declared him a public enemy. Marcus pardoned him, and the consequence of that was that Avidius Cassius was actually assassinated by his own officers because they all wanted to surrender and back down, and he was the only one that wanted to continue fighting. So famously, this was a war, a civil war that ended more or less with only one death, and the other soldiers surrendered, and Marcus was as good as his word, and he allowed them to return to their garrisons without being punished. And not only that, he actively protected the relatives of Avidius Cassius from being persecuted by the Senate in the aftermath of the civil war. So it's a really odd example. Marcus, on the one hand, was willing to use the force of the Roman legions in order to fight a usurper, if that was his only option, but he preferred to use peaceful measures and diplomacy in order to resolve the situation with the minimum amount of bloodshed.
The next question is from Christian Sigmund, and he says, some tend to swallow down their anger/disappointment instead of expressing it openly. It can create a false sense of harmony. How do I deal with my anger/disappointment once it's there?
Okay, this is an interesting question. Again, it's a slightly complex question. Really, there's a couple of things that I'd have to comment on there separately. First of all, it used to be believed in the field of psychotherapy that there was a therapeutic mechanism known as catharsis, abreaction, or venting. And particularly in relation to feelings of anger, people used to think that if they vented anger, they expressed anger, that would somehow purge it from their system, and it would alleviate or relieve them of those feelings of anger. And we now know that that's not true. There's no theoretical basis for this concept, and also in practice, it doesn't really seem to work very well. So there have been studies specifically on anger management using venting techniques that show that it's not particularly therapeutic, and in fact, in many cases, it's counterproductive. So somebody who gets a baseball bat and hits a cushion in order to get all their angry feelings out won't really end up being less angry than they were to begin with. And in some cases, they might actually become more prone to anger because they simply reinforce the habit of expressing angry feelings. So there may be some exceptions to that, but generally speaking, venting or expressing angry feelings isn't particularly therapeutic. What's more therapeutic is addressing the underlying beliefs and value judgments that cause the feelings of anger in the first place. If you like, getting to the cognitive root cause of the anger is what we would tend to do more today. And the other point I'd make about this, though, is that in psychology, we sometimes talk about the lump theory of emotion. And the lump theory of emotion is the idea that when people speak about anxiety or depression or anger, they talk about those feelings as if they're just a kind of homogeneous lump. Whereas if we're actually studying anger seriously, we would view it more like a cake that's baked from lots of different ingredients. There's flour and sugar and milk and stuff in it. And so anger isn't one thing. It's a bunch of different things combined together in a particular way. So this is a much more nuanced way of understanding anger and a much more helpful way of understanding it. So anger is composed of physiological sensations, action tendencies, desires, beliefs, patterns of thinking, all sorts of different components go to bake the cake of anger. And understanding what those components are more accurately gives us more control over our feelings of anger. But the most fundamental, the most important, and the most helpful distinction that we can make in understanding anger, or indeed any other emotion, is to differentiate, like the Stoics did, between the voluntary aspects of anger and the involuntary aspects of anger. Because if we don't even separate those two things out, then the way that we deal with our feelings of anger is just going to be a complete mess. Right? And most people don't separate those things out. They just mash it all together in a big ball. And that means that they're not really dealing with anger in a very nuanced or informed way at all. So at the very least, we need to draw a clearer line between the bits of anger that are directly under voluntary control and the bits that are reflex-like or automatic. And what the Stoics advise us to do, and in fact what most modern psychotherapists would advise us to do, is to accept the involuntary feelings of anger without acting them out. So accepting the feelings, enduring them, riding them out, tolerating them, viewing them with a kind of studied indifference, and then changing the voluntary response to anger. So if somebody comes up and spits in my face in the street, I'm going to feel my blood pressure rise. I'm going to have an involuntary reflex-like automatic response. And all that we can really do is accept that feeling and then avoid acting on it by becoming violent in response or doing something we might regret. But ruminating about that incident and maybe fantasizing about getting revenge on the person is something that's under voluntary control. And that's something I can choose not to do, something that I can modify. And in fact, I could respond to the initial trigger and the initial feelings differently in a more constructive, pro-social, a more prudent manner. So I think the key really is accepting the involuntary parts and changing the voluntary parts, basically.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Joanna Vensing, and she asks, if we talk about oneness, the influence of our past, and triggers in the moment, she wonders, what is the Stoics' view on free will, and can mindfulness increase free will?
That's a complicated question as well. The short answer is that the Stoics were metaphysical determinists of a particular type known as compatibilism. And what does that actually mean? Is a little bit harder to explain. So compatibilists are people who believe that free will and causal determinism are not two mutually exclusive concepts. They're compatible. So it would take a long time to enter into the philosophical debate about free will and determinism. That would be a whole lecture. But basically, that's the position adopted by the Stoics. They believe that our actions are causally determined, but when we talk about being free, what we really mean is that our will isn't obstructed by external events, so we can exercise free will despite the fact that the whole universe is, in their view, like clockwork. It's entirely causally determined. Can we maximize free will by mindfulness? Yes, but then I think we'd be kind of using the word free will in a slightly different sense. There's kind of two different senses of the word free will perhaps there. And the Stoics would say, yes, of course, we can, that they think that we sacrifice our freedom by becoming enslaved to our passions, such as anger. This is so the main concern the Stoics have about freedom in this sense is they think when we become angry, we become less free. And that when we learn to rise above our emotions, like that's really the key to personal freedom. And the key to that, yes, is a type of mindfulness. It consists in noticing the value judgments that we're making and how those value judgments are causing strong feelings like anger, and learning to suspend those value judgments. Basically, the Stoics think we're wrong to invest that much intrinsic value in external events, and that we should place more value on our own character traits, on our own virtues. And that if we make this upheaval, like kind of almost turning our values upside down and inside out, if we can go through this, the Stoics actually call it a conversion. The Greek word is epistropha, like a complete turning around of our moral values. Then we liberate ourselves, and they think that's fundamentally what human freedom consists in. That we're liberating ourselves from the prevailing values of of society, the materialism, consumerism, hedonism, narcissism, and so on that we find in society. The Stoics think we're kind of doomed to get sucked into all of that unless we use philosophy, unless we use reason to see through it and to liberate ourselves from it, and to realize that true value resides in our own character and not in external events. That's really the Stoic definition of freedom.
I believe this is the last question. Perhaps how would you define hatred and its relation to anger?
The Stoics have a formal definition of hatred, and it's really simple. After having given some more convoluted answers, the Stoics define hatred as taking pleasure in someone else's suffering, and so they think it's very closely related to anger. Is the desire to harm someone or cause them suffering, and hatred is in their view just the tendency to take pleasure in that.
Okay. I think that was the last question for now. We are at 8 o'clock right now, and so I just wanted to ask if there's anything else you'd like to add, or just bring everything to a summary. It's so much to put into such a short time. I think we just skimmed through a lot of different topics and themes, but it was really nice to have you here. And was there anything else you'd like to end with?
That there is a great deal that the Stoics have so much more to say about this. Like I said, there's an entire book by Seneca on the Stoic therapy of anger that goes way beyond what I've had a chance to say today. And also, I can't emphasize enough that I really think dealing with anger, our own anger, is the royal road to self-improvement. It tends to be neglected in our society, and it's a great opportunity for helping yourself and helping other people at the same time. And I also really think it's a pressing need in modern society that many of the social problems that we're facing are caused by anger running amok and prejudice. And that to some extent, the way that modern media functions, the news media and social media, by their very nature, potentially contribute to some of the problems that we're experiencing with anger and the way that it's affecting society. And in particular, obviously, a very visible example of that is the rise in domestic terrorism that's threatening the US at the moment, which is something that's become a priority under the Biden administration. So it's going to dominate the news cycle going forward, I would think. So these are big topics. The Stoics thought that addressing anger was extremely important because of the impact that it has on society, and I think we're seeing that once again today.
And we want to say thank you so much for coming and participating to everyone here today. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Paul.